In the Renaissance, people started keeping track of time. In 1510, precision mechanic Peter Henlein invented the pocket watch. It became a powerful tool. Merchants earned a fortune with it, while it helped seafarers with their navigation. Shortly before, Columbus had discovered America and the known world tripled in size. People began to understand the Earth. An empire was created where the people owed all of this to the new portable time. Scholars were able to measure and calculate the course of the heavenly bodies. They discovered the mechanisms of planetary motion and finally placed the sun at the heart of their system. It was a departure to the stars, at least in the mind. The invention of the pocket watch became the turbocharger of history. Florence in 1504. Leonardo da Vinci was the lead character in an era that was to become known as the Renaissance, during which the best-known painting of all time was to be created. The Mona Lisa, the mysterious beauty with the inimitable smile. It's probably a portrait of Lisa del Giocondo, the wife of a cloth and silk merchant from Florence. Reported that Leonardo didn't complete the painting for years. The artist was always at odds with his works. He was never happy with them and was always trying to improve them. Pope Leo X said of Leonardo, "This man will never achieve anything." How wrong he was. Leonardo was a polarizing figure. He was described as foppish, as excessively vain, as a fashionista who stood by his homosexuality at a time when gay men were being burnt at the stake. Leonardo da Vinci is considered the greatest polymath of all time. The star of the Renaissance was much more than just a painter. But for the brilliant creator of the Mona Lisa, painting was maybe just a necessary evil. A mere 15 paintings are attributed to Leonardo today. Most have been lost because he was constantly experimenting with new paint mixes, many of which decomposed over time. He cared most about inventing, more than about painting.
Leonardo war vielleicht, was sein innerstes Streben.
When it comes to his inner workings, Leonardo was a seeker, an explorer, someone who was interested in new secrets, more than a painter who would have had to nurture his craft laboriously every day, brushstroke after brushstroke. We know he spent days making minor corrections to a canvas, that he wasn't in front of a canvas all the time. Maybe he just painted to make a living. His paintings were in great demand, after all. They were extremely well done, at least those that were completed. Maybe he just painted to earn money, so he had the freedom to pursue his scientific research.
Die Freiheit zu haben, seine wissenschaftlichen Forschungen zu betreiben.
Cities had an insatiable appetite for each other. Their constant battles fueled progress, however. War as a driver of art.
Krieg hatte in der Renaissance nicht nur negative Auswirkungen.
War didn't just have negative effects in the Renaissance. It ensured that huge sums of money were mobilized through the condottieri, the war contractors. They were often based in small places from where they waged the wars of the big players for good money. Money from Florence, Milan, Naples, Venice and Rome flowed into smaller places. If you go to Italy and you take pleasure in the diverse appearances of these small towns, you get an idea of what it meant back then to turn war and iron into gold, and gold into art.
Milan in 1485. Leonardo's employer was Ludovico Sforza, who ruled the city-state. In his application to Ludovico, Leonardo advertised himself as a military engineer and maker of weapons. He only mentioned at the end that he also knew about painting and sculpture. Ludovico was getting ready for war. He had great expansion plans. And so Leonardo built high-tech weapons for the Sforzas. Inspired by antiquity, he combined the idea of a closed chariot with the tortoise formation of the Roman legions, an armored vehicle with incredible firepower. However, it failed in practice because of a lack of energy. It was too heavy, and the steam engine hadn't been invented yet. The Codex Atlanticus contains more than 1,000 pages with sketches by Leonardo. He designed a perpetual motion machine, a gearbox, and vehicles powered by springs. Like Heinlein's pocket watch, but many of his imaginations still cause us headaches today. Some consider his cog device to be a calculating machine. Critics say that interpretation goes much too far. In the Renaissance, there was no way of actually constructing this mechanical gear train. Leonardo knew that, and so he elevated himself onto a theoretical. In 1495, Leonardo also showed himself to be a brilliant entertainer and master of ceremonies for the parties of the nobility. He presented a further invention at these parties, one that centuries later would be counted as one of his most spectacular. An automatic knight that could walk under its own power. Allegedly, it could even lift its elbows and move its shoulders and wrists, a construction that generated great excitement at the court in Milan. But how did it work? The knight was moved by a complicated system of 13 pulleys, all hidden by the suit of armor. Did the brilliant Leonardo invent a robot 600 years ago? Professor Uwe Schwiegelsohn runs the Robotics Research Institute in Dortmund in Germany. He specializes in autonomous robots that work without external control. They can take their own decisions, so to speak. He's familiar with Leonardo's prototype.
Leonardo da Vinci hat die Mechanik der Bewegungen erkannt, möglicherweise auch aus seinen anatomischen Studien.
Leonardo da Vinci recognized the mechanics of motion, maybe from his anatomical studies, and he tried to give artificial devices motion using pulleys. He didn't have the propulsion options we have today with electric motors. Mechanics wasn't developed in his day. It only truly flourished following Newton, and the materials Leonardo had available were quite rudimentary.
Waren natürlich relativ rudimentär.
Leonardo had no screws, no crankshafts or metal cogwheels, nor did he have a power unit, but he recognized the principle of the mechanical man. Attack of the now Devils, RoboCup world champion in 2016. These robotic footballers, roughly 50 centimeters tall, act autonomously. They size up their opponent and the ball, they plan their moves, and sometimes they even score goals. Football is a complex game and well suited as an experimental environment for the development of a new generation of robots. Research today requires a team, not an individual, never mind how brilliant. Modern success strategies are fundamentally different from how Leonardo worked.
Leonardo hatte eine Universität in seinem Kopf.
Leonardo had a university in his head. He wrote down the entire knowledge of his day. That's not possible with today's knowledge anymore. If we want technological and scientific progress today, we're dependent on a number of people from different fields cooperating closely and working together to produce new results.
Dann neue Ergebnisse zu erzielen.
But in order to collaborate with members of other faculties, it's necessary to at least understand the basics of the other fields. In order to build robots, it takes programmers, engineers, electronics engineers, and also experts in human anatomy and movement sequences. The robotic footballers are among the most advanced robotic developments, but the robotics field is still very far from creating a real R2-D2. Leonardo amazed those around him, but he scared people too. His superiority threw up questions like, how did he do that? How can these people create something so outstanding? What made the greats of the Renaissance tick? Joachim Funke is a psychology professor from Heidelberg. He doesn't believe that the brains of the Renaissance geniuses were any different. He isn't looking for an answer in the function and anatomy of the brain, but in the strategies of the scholarly artists. Funke is an expert in problem solving and creativity.
Ohne Wissen ist Kreativität nicht vorstellbar.
Without knowledge, creativity wouldn't be conceivable. Add to that a broad spectrum of interests. His curiosity spanned many fields. He also paid close attention. From a psychological perspective, that's very important. Another factor will have been his competitiveness. Those around him accepted that he crossed boundaries. That was the spirit of the Renaissance. People weren't forced to believe anything anymore. They were able to find out how something works. That was a huge driving force.
Antrieb für die damalige Zeit.
Creativity is a new arrangement of knowledge that must already exist in the brain. The creative spark can ignite something that's already there, but a high degree of education alone isn't enough. Da Vinci was a lateral thinker who explored new avenues.
Sich nicht immer mit den gleichen Leuten und Ideen umgeben.
Don't just always accept the same ideas and be around the same people. Listen to other opinions and worldviews. Take a different perspective. In the past, you had a court jester to tell you different opinions. That's still very helpful because you need a corrective and you should be challenged, and a jester can do that. You have to get up from your comfortable sofa and head out into new areas and try new things. If you want to be creative, you need to have courage.
Der Kreative braucht Mut.
Leonardo's preference for mechanics was in line with the spirit of the time. Many multi-talented people like him were looking for the engines that set humans, the Earth and the universe in motion. Clockwork was, mechanically, the most elaborate thing on offer in Leonardo's time. In around 1505, Peter Heinlein invented a portable watch. People started treating time as if they owned it, but those who earned money with time by loaning money for periods of time while charging interest were committing a mortal sin. Time belonged to God alone.
Das Verbot, Zinsen zu nehmen, steht in der Bibel und gehört zu den ganz wichtigen biblischen.
The prohibition on charging interest is in the Bible and is one of the really important biblical prohibitions, almost as important as "thou shalt not kill." That's because people believe that humans shouldn't profit from time, because time belonged to God. But in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the economy played a quite different role. Money must circulate in the economy, and if the availability of money and time is an advantage, then you can remunerate their worth. As a result, there were more and more ways in practice of avoiding this ban on charging interest.
The imperial decrees of the 16th century now also allowed Christian moneylenders to charge interest on money loaned. The maximum was 5%. Up until then, the credit industry had been solely in the hands of Jewish moneylenders. This now changed. While Martin Luther denounced the practice of charging interest, the Swiss reformer John Calvin had quite a different opinion.
Johannes Calvin ging von der Vorstellung aus, ich kann an meinem wirtschaftlichen Erfolg sehen, ob
Calvin said one could see from one's economic success whether one was predestined to salvation or damnation. That meant people didn't just sit around to see whether they would be chosen. They worked incredibly hard. The great sociologist Max Weber said that Calvinism was the father of capitalism. We know that other religious movements of the 16th and 17th centuries did just as much for the economy. It's a pretty theory, but it was the general forces of society at the time, along with technical developments, that led to the incredible economic boom.
Und die großen technischen Entwicklungen.
The city of Zurich started setting up official currency exchanges in 1419. The money changers tended to be goldsmiths or master coiners because they had to be able to tell the value of the coins. Changed currencies, but they also issued loans. Later, with its Zwinglian and Calvinist tradition, Switzerland became a banking pioneer, and affluence became a symbol of divine favor. Measuring time is still inseparably tied to exploring the heavens. The mind of Renaissance man left the small world behind and reached out for the stars. Many medieval clocks were astronomical clocks. The exact measurements of time is a necessary requirement for studying the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. It was the start of an age in which scholars for the first time bravely proclaimed that the Church's worldview was incorrect. The sun didn't revolve around the Earth, and the Earth was not the center of the universe. Frombork in Poland in around 1540. Nicholas Copernicus was a canon of the cathedral as well as a high-ranking government official and a polymath. He was a physician, had a law degree, and he was a mathematician. And he was also an economist who wrote a highly regarded work on the theory of money. But his personal passion was astronomy. His astronomical observations and calculations contradicted the generally accepted model put forward by the ancient scholar Claudius Ptolemy, namely that the Earth was at the center of the solar system. This geocentric worldview was also taught by the Church. But Copernicus saw the sun at the center of the solar system. Even though he spent 30 years working on his model, he didn't publish it. Friends and confidants, including high-ranking clerics, tried to persuade him to publish his work, but without success.
Copernicus hatte in der Tat etwas Angst davor, seine These zu veröffentlichen.
Copernicus was scared of publishing his theory because he was frightened he would make himself a laughingstock. Educated people knew that the Earth wasn't flat, that it was a sphere. With Copernicus's worldview, this sphere was also moving. It spun on its own axis, and it also traveled around the sun at high speed.
Da dachten die Menschen, das bringt Dinge mit sich, die wir nicht beherrschen können. Auf einmal
People thought this would produce certain consequences, such as strong headwinds and objects falling over and things like that. And then there was the theological aspect that Martin Luther threw into the mix. He said to Copernicus that it was written in the Bible that the sun moved around the earth, and that scared Copernicus out of publishing.
Angst, seine These überhaupt zu veröffentlichen.
Martin Luther called him a fool. Copernicus's model was dismissed not so much as heretical, but more as fantastical. It wasn't until 70 years after his death that Galileo's observations provided convincing arguments, but the physical proof had to wait for another 300 years. Nicholas Copernicus supplied the astronomical model for our solar system, refuting the ancient scholar Ptolemy, and that in itself was revolutionary. The Earth was removed from the center of the universe and classed as a simple planet that orbited the Sun along with others. Copernicus saw how the stars moved in the night sky. He realized that this impression was the result of the Earth's own rotation. All the orbits went around the Sun. Consequently, the actual center of the world had to be near the Sun. Almost no other discovery has had such a great significance on our time. Our departure to the stars started 500 years ago in a scholar's study. Without Copernicus, without spaceflight, without satellite-supported communication, our lives today would be very different.
Für uns heute hat die
The
Entdeckung
calculations performed by Copernicus have real impacts on us today. We sent our spaceships into space knowing where the planets were. Had Ptolemy's worldview been correct, we would have reached none of those planets, and it would all have been a waste.
alles Makulatur natürlich.
It wasn't until the Jacob staff came along that it became possible to determine latitude at sea using astronomical calculations. A breakthrough in seafaring. It made it possible to navigate on the high seas without landmarks. A further achievement came in the form of the ephemerides, astronomical tables, calculations by the German astronomer and mathematician Johannes Müller, known as Regiomontanus. For the years 1475 to 1506, his tables set out the location of the celestial bodies. Together with the Jacob staff, they guided sailors on their journeys.
Regiomontanus hat damals die Trigonometrie in Europa
Regiomontanus made people aware of trigonometry. He published his own work, taking advantage of the new invention of printing. Trigonometric solutions occur constantly in every receiver, in 1 billion receivers.
in 1 Milliarde Empfänger zu jedem Zeitpunkt vor.
Without trigonometry, there would be no satellite navigation, no GPS. Europe is currently developing its own satellite-supported navigation system called Galileo. But countries outside of Europe are also involved. China, for example. The navigation system is intended to work independently of the American GPS, but to be more precise, down to the nearest centimetre. Be it the Jacob staff or Galileo, the trigonometrical approach is the key to new routes. The search for new trade routes also drove explorers to new goals. Put in modern terms, they wanted to maximize their profits. The people of the Renaissance started thinking about completely new questions. What lies beyond the known world, and how can I get there? Europe's merchants recognized that it was cheaper to bring large quantities of pepper, cinnamon and silk to Europe via the Portuguese shipping routes than to transport them in smaller units on the overland route controlled by Venice. And with that, the Venetian spice monopoly collapsed. Many trading establishments of the Renaissance invested in shipping. Portugal and Spain.
Kaufleute. Als Kaufmann wollen Sie interessante
Merchants wanted to get their hands on interesting, luxurious and beautiful things and sell them for as much profit as possible.
gibt sie erst recht.
These things existed in the Mediterranean, but even more so in the Far East. And so merchants, along with Marco Polo, set off to search for silk and incense and other luxurious fabrics. They traveled the world. They were followed by warriors and missionaries, and sometimes by artists, thinkers and explorers. So they all fueled each other, hoping to get beyond their own horizons.
Oft immer die eigenen Horizonte zu übersteigen.
Lisbon in 1484. Maybe he was just hours away from his life's dream coming true. The 33-year-old Christopher Columbus had an audience with the Portuguese king John II. The professional seafarer from Genoa had profound knowledge of mathematics and cartography and was a passionate defender of the idea of the ancient philosopher Aristotle, who claimed that Asia could be reached in just a few days by a western route. The ancient scholars estimated that Europe and Asia made up roughly half of the Earth's width. Columbus believed that Eurasia was much bigger than that even. In fact, Eurasia only makes up around a third of the Earth's circumference. Columbus imagined the Earth to be very much smaller than it really is, namely half its size. He believed that the western route to China and India was 4,500 kilometers, a challenge for him and his crew, but doable. In actual fact, it's a journey of 20,000 kilometers. That went far beyond the capabilities of his time. Columbus, therefore, was taking on not only a risk, but one that he had miscalculated. King John's experts believed that he was mistaken and refused to give him financial support. He only got that 8 years later from the Spanish king Ferdinand II. After 6 weeks at sea on the 12th of October 1492, Columbus reached the Bahamas, then Cuba and Hispaniola. He believed he had found the western route to Asia. He thought Hispaniola was the Chinese coast. In his report, he promised the Spanish crown as much gold as it needed and as many slaves as it asked for. Columbus discovered the New World and plunged it into catastrophe.
Also Kolumbus verstand es, Schiffe durch schwierige Wasser zu navigieren.
Columbus was good at navigating ships through difficult waters, but he was a very poor manager. He wasn't able to keep his own men together, and ultimately, the Spanish crown took away his powers. America was already populated when he discovered it, so it wasn't a real discovery in that sense. But his arrival opened the door to unprecedented disasters. Millions of indigenous people died at the hands of the germs that the Europeans brought with them. They were interested in gold and yet more gold, a little bit in God, but more so in spices. His travels opened up the newly discovered lands, and that robbed the indigenous population of its good fortunes for a good long time.
During his second trip to Hispaniola in 1493, Columbus found the fort he had built had been destroyed by the indigenous people. He immediately embarked on his revenge and never stopped. Bartolomé de las Casas, who later became the defender of the rights of the indigenous population in the New World, described the inconceivable cruelty of the conquerors. On his arrival, there were between 400,000 and 1 million people living on Hispaniola. By 1542, that figure had dropped to less than 200. It was the systematic extermination of the indigenous population, genocide.
Die einzige Rechtfertigung für Kolonialisierung und übrigens auch Versklavung,
The only justification for colonization and for the slavery that was legitimized by the papal court came through missionary work. Unbelievers could be converted to Christianity. The problem was, when they had converted, when they had been baptized, they couldn't be enslaved anymore. But the slave trade was profitable. Their only justification was that they led people to the correct faith, thereby opening up paradise for them.
Columbus believed until the day he died that he had found the sea route to the Chinese mainland. His discovery changed the world. The threshold nations Spain and Portugal became imperial superpowers, but he was also the first in a line of cruel conquerors. What drove him? A lust for adventure? The promise of power, wealth, or fame?
Kolumbus war sicher ein Mensch, der Ruhm suchte, der
Columbus was definitely someone who wanted fame and fortune, but he was also a very devout person. He thought he helped countless individuals by bringing their souls to the Christian faith. At least there are many indications that he believed this. As was so often the case, the desire for profit and fame was mixed with medieval motivations. The Renaissance had two sides to it, and so too did Columbus.
Die Renaissance hat ihre zwei Gesichter und Kolumbus eben auch.
Emperor Charles V, thanks to the South America and in Asia. When the sun set in Mexico City, it was already day in Manila in the Philippines. In 1530, he was crowned by the Pope. Already King Charles I of Spain, he now became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. He saw himself as a universal monarch, defender of the faith, appointed by God. He issued several decrees in an attempt to counteract the enslavement of the indigenous population. In 15...
Das letzte Bild, auf das sein Blick gefallen sein mag, ist ein Bild Tizians.
The last thing he might have seen is a painting by Titian that hung near his deathbed, where you can see him in the white gown of a confessor, barefoot. He has put down the crown and the insignia of the emperor, and he's praying to the Holy Trinity. Maybe that's how he saw himself at the end of his life. In amongst that, the attempt to create a universal monarchy, not in the sense of a cruel dictatorship, but in the sense of supreme rule over all the Christian rulers. He failed across the board. In the end, he abdicated. But I think deep down, we'll find a very devout person.
Dass wir im tiefen Inneren einen sehr gläubigen Menschen finden.
Charles's empire was greedy for silver and gold. Between 1541 and 1560, 67 tons of gold and 480 tons of silver reached Spain, triggering an economic crisis.
Gold und Silber waren Wertaufbewahrungsmittel, war das praktisch einzig vernünftige.
Gold and silver were currencies that stored value, the only sensible medium of exchange. Then suddenly, the whole system was flooded. There were distortions in production, and suddenly your currency, gold and silver, dramatically declined in value. Expectations had to find their new level. That always happens when you have a shock to the system from the outside.
Wenn eine Schwemme, ein realer Schock von außen auf ein System kommt.
In the Middle Ages, the Jews were the only people in Europe who were able to issue loans and charge interest. Jewish businessmen controlled the international financial world. For that reason, some of them saw them as profiteers and cursed them for it. Brutal pogroms took place in the Iberian Peninsula. The Jewish population was persecuted, killed, or expelled. The Jewish financial system collapsed and the European money market reoriented itself. In the middle of this development stood the small German town of Augsburg. It became the financial capital of the known world, the headquarters of the Fugger Empire. The Fugger family business, which grew to be a European-wide company in just a few decades, went back to Jakob Fugger, Europe's most significant merchant, mining entrepreneur, and banker between 1495 and 1525.
Fugger hat den Staat finanziert, etwas überspitzt gesagt. Der Staat hat ihn dafür...
Jakob Fugger funded the state. The state gave him unique opportunities to use or exploit the land. On the other hand, Fugger himself didn't do anything by halves. He invested a lot of money in estates that are still at the heart of the Fugger Foundations.
Die bis heute übrigens eine Grundlage der Fuggerschen Stiftung.
He used calculable risks to make money, and he worked with those in power. But he also always invested in safe real estate. He always diversified his investments, and he had a good eye for what was doable. So he was very successful.
Hat äußerst erfolgreich und immer mit Blick auf das Machbare im ganz großen Stil gewirtschaftet.
Fugger, pious and one of the most powerful men of his day, wanted an aristocratic title. With one foot still in the Middle Ages, Fugger was nevertheless a manager with a modern spirit.
Nehmen Sie Albrecht Dürers berühmtes Porträt von Jakob Fugger.
Take Dürer's famous portrait of Jakob Fugger. put this man into a grey suit and take the gold cap off his head, and you've got a modern CEO. He was a tough and incredibly efficient manager, that's undoubtedly true. But he was also a contrite Christian. The best evidence for that is that he built a whole estate for the poor in his hometown of Augsburg, the Fuggerei of 1516. That's a rich, successful businessman balancing his books with God. So he's investing in the well-being of his soul. And that plays a big role here too.
Fugger was active around the world. He gave loans to princes and the church, and in return he negotiated mining rights, trading privileges and estates. The income he received was much higher than the borrowing costs, another product of the Renaissance, a type of global player. But Fugger combined his entrepreneurial spirit with social commitment. In 1521, he paid for the Fuggerei, a Renaissance time capsule in the middle of Augsburg. The Fuggerei is the oldest social housing project in history, and it's still used as such. The 67 houses are now home to 150 Catholic residents of Augsburg. The entry conditions are still the same as they were in the 16th century. Anyone wanting to live in the Fuggerei has to be from Augsburg, a Catholic, and of good reputation. And it's still maintained by the fortune managed by the Fugger Foundation, a financial instrument set up in the Renaissance and still in effect today. The annual rent also remains unchanged, 1 Rhenish guilder, or 88 euro cents. Compared with the living standards of most people of the Renaissance, the houses in the Fuggerei are positively luxurious. A home for an entire family with around 60 square meters, generous and bright, at least by Renaissance standards. In addition to the symbolic rent, Jakob Fugger placed another condition on the residents of the Fuggerei: regular prayer. Every day they were to say 1 Our Father, 1 Creed, and 1 Hail Mary for Fugger, the founder, and his family. The prayers for him and his family paved his way to paradise. That's what people believed in the Middle Ages. Another investment in the salvation of his soul was the construction of the Fugger Chapel, a burial place for a dynasty and an unmissable statement of its social significance. Jakob Fugger hired important artists, first and foremost Albrecht Dürer, who designed the tombstones for his brothers Georg and Ulrich Fugger. The Fugger Chapel in St. Anna was the first church interior in Germany to be built in the Renaissance style. This is where Jakob and his brothers found their final resting place. This donation says a lot about Jakob, his commercial foresight, and his attitude in general. He must have believed that there was a financial solution to the salvation of the soul and the afterlife. Jakob Fugger, a pious Christian and a financial genius, and one of the richest men of his time.
Fugger was incredibly rich. The gap was immense. If you think of the sum that Fugger and a consortium stumped up to fund the imperial election of Charles V, it was more than 800,000 guilders. A craftsman would have had to work 32,000 years to earn that.
Fugger also made money with the fear of hell. Its terrible torments were everywhere in Fugger's time. The church preached that punishments in hell could be lessened or even avoided entirely because it had been granted the divine powers to remit them. But this indulgence, as it was called, didn't come for free. The sales slogan of the Dominican friar Johann Tetzel, one of the most notorious sellers of indulgences, was, "As soon as a coin in the box does ring, the soul from purgatory does spring." He even sold indulgences for blasphemy and murder. In the autumn of 1511, the 28-year-old Augustinian friar Martin Luther was in Rome. He too was seeking indulgence. He climbed the holy stairs of the Lateran on his knees to achieve forgiveness for his sins and free his deceased relatives from purgatory. The Lateran Palace, the official seat of the popes, a 16th century Renaissance building built by Pope Sixtus V. The money spinner of the Renaissance popes was the sale of indulgences. Between 1470 and 1530, 6 popes ruled Rome, who were later to go down collectively in history as the Renaissance popes. Their papacies were characterized by a previously unseen level of corruption, immorality, greed, and calamitous power politics, or so their critics say. Pope Alexander VI was particularly notorious. He celebrated orgies with well-known whores in the Vatican. Martin Luther labeled the Roman Church as the whore of Babylon and the Holy City as a hotbed of sin.
Wenn man über Renaissance-Päpste redet,
When we talk about the Renaissance popes, then we often hear terrible stories, and you get the impression that they triggered the Reformation with their immoral behavior. But that's a very one-sided story. They were modernizers, they were Renaissance men, they were princes who held court in line with the European standards of the time.
einen Hof geführt haben.
In 1508, Pope Julius II commissioned the 33-year-old Michelangelo Buonarroti to cover the interior of the Sistine Chapel in frescoes. But Michelangelo didn't want the job. Painting wasn't his strength. He primarily saw himself as a sculptor, he said. But Julius, more a warrior than a man of God, asserted himself. Michelangelo asked for artistic freedom. "Do what you want," Julius replied. 520 square meters of frescoes to be painted overhead, a torturous work of epic proportions. The frescoes in the vaulted ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and Leonardo's Mona Lisa are indisputably the most famous paintings of the Renaissance, if not the whole of art history. And the interpretation of the creation of Adam is the most reproduced work of art in the world, a God who overcomes people like a thunderstorm. And a last judgment that depicts the heavenly host naked like the gods of Mount Olympus, the brave work of a great man only made possible thanks to his papal patron.
Wir hätten keine Peterskirche.
We wouldn't have St. Peter's. We wouldn't have all this wonderful art in Rome. We wouldn't have many pieces of music if these Renaissance popes hadn't existed. Renaissance popes are ambivalent, like the whole of modernity. They have admirably good traits, and they also behave like princes, like Machiavelli, free and confident. And sometimes they put their church brief on the back burner, or even forgot about it altogether.
Oder vielleicht sogar vergessen.
Pope Julius II, Il Terribile. That's what the Romans called him. The architect by his side, Donato Bramante, called Maestro Rovinante, Master of Destruction. This duo put their stamp on Rome. Julius had buildings torn down, squares enlarged, and roads rebuilt. Donato Bramante asserted himself as a hip architect in Rome with the cloister at Santa Maria della Pace, the Chiostro di Bramante. The client was Cardinal Oliviero Carafa, an influential prince of the church. Bramante came to fame with the Tempietto di Bramante, the little temple inspired by Roman round temples. It's considered a paradigm of high Renaissance architecture. Pope Julius II asserted himself against all the protests of his cardinals and had the venerable Basilica of Constantine demolished. He wanted to build the biggest church of Christendom in its place, St. Peter's. Julius was a gigantomaniac. His basilica was also to house his monumental tomb, bigger than anything the world had ever seen. St. Peter's as the mausoleum for Julius II. Donato Bramante got the commission. Construction started in 1506. 40 years were to pass before sculptor, painter, poet and scientist Michelangelo became the architect and site manager of St. Peter's. In 1547, the 72-year-old Michelangelo Buonarroti took over the supervision of Europe's largest building site. The dome of St. Peter's, the largest self-supporting masonry structure in the world. The dome with its ribs was his idea. Its construction was the pinnacle of his artistic career. His creative life lasted 70 years. He considered himself a sculptor, but he created epoch-making works as a painter and architect. He spent years in quarries, always searching for material. He literally moved mountains. Michelangelo lived through 9 popes and worked until his final breath. He died at 89, a biblical age in his day. He was the last among the great scholarly artists of the Renaissance. The year of his death is considered by many art historians as the end of this era. Michelangelo died on the 18th of February, 1564. But even this masterpiece of the Renaissance was funded by the fear Christians had of facing punishment in hell. It was Pope Leo X who supported the sale of indulgences to fund the new building. Regularly in later writings and speeches, he fulminated against the trade in indulgences, a trade which became synonymous with this moral decline, with the greed of the Church and its popes, and with the triggering of an event that would go down in history as the Reformation. A simple friar defied the emperor and the pope and split the church. Not a revolutionary, but a reformer. Just 2 generations after Luther, Europe was shaken by a conflict more gruesome than any that had gone before, the 30 Years' War. The fighting between Catholics and Protestants devastated the empire. Martin Luther castigated the practice of selling indulgences very publicly in 95 theses. In just a few months, Luther published more than 80 individual treatises and collections. There were more than 600 editions. Luther became a media star. Printing became the first mass medium of humankind.
Es gäbe keine Reformation ohne die Massenmedien.
There wouldn't have been a Reformation without the mass media of the 16th century. Martin Luther wrote theses about a relatively abstruse theological problem, indulgences. But these theses spread all over southern Germany in just a few weeks. It was printing. It was flysheets and pamphlets that spread all across the empire and mobilized people. People read, and they read to others, and the issues were discussed with people who couldn't read.
Man hat mit Menschen, die nicht lesen konnten, über das Gelesene diskutiert.
How do people work? What drives us? Questions that scholars were now able to discuss publicly thanks to the new mass medium. Global communication started in the Renaissance. For the first time, it was possible for thousands of people to refer to the same contents at the same time. It was the first time the future could be depicted and planned in a realistic fashion. People understood what moved them. They copied themselves. The first machine men were created. An anticipation of a future in which robots play football. Within just a few generations, the known world tripled in size. Global transport and global trade became a reality for the first time in the Renaissance. The people didn't just travel their own planet. They also laid the groundwork for trips to distant worlds and the exploration of the universe.
The legacy of the Renaissance has never died. It has remained alive. I think we can say that the Industrial Revolution and therefore our modern world wouldn't have been possible without all the things that were invented in the Renaissance.
At no other time in its history has humankind experienced a comparable boost in development. The Renaissance even beats our current fast-changing age. Never before was so much developed, invented, moved, changed, revolutionized, and rejected in such a short space of time. A development driven by people who mastered what was seemingly impossible because they understood their world. The Renaissance is a plea against closed minds and a cult of experts for intellectual curiosity and the courage to take unusual paths. It's a story about people who didn't have faith, but wanted to know and wouldn't accept limits. The Renaissance is our past and our future.